All right, today I'm doing a quick rundown on comparing the Bosch 1617 router with the MRC23. Now, as far as the 1617, that's got a 12 amp motor rated at 2¼ horsepower, and the MRC23 is a little bit bigger. It's got a 15 amp motor rated at 2.3 horsepower. So we'll look at these combo kits both in plunge base and fixed mode and see how they compare, see which router might be best for you. So starting with the fixed base comparison, I think the 1617 is somewhat basic but functional. It's got the classic styling and the wooden handles, and I think for a lot of woodworkers it's just a functional router, and it's one you reach for if you have to do edge profiling. The grips I think can be a little bit slippery just because they're perfectly round and they're made of finished wood. So compared to a rubber overmolded design, you're not going to have quite the same grip. And I find also the grips are very low, which in general for center of gravity you would think would be a good thing, but I can't quite get my hands underneath between the router handles and the workpiece, so I think it's a little bit tight in that regard for me. But again, user preference will dictate whether that's the one you reach for or not. Switching over to the MRC23, I think it is more of a premium feel to it just because it's got the triggers in the handle, and that's thanks to the low voltage track system that connects the motor with either of the bases, whether that be the fixed base or in plunge mode. So that adds a measure of safety, having the trigger right in the handle. And just the ergonomics on it are really sweet too. They're kind of elongated handles. They fit really nicely in the hands. Center of gravity is low and well balanced, just how you'd want it. And the top of the router is actually rubberized too. So when you flip it over, it just feels nice and secure for changing bits as well. So if we have a look at the router lock mechanism on the fixed base, it's pretty straightforward. I always find it easier to flip the router upside down to remove the base, press the coarse adjustment knob, that'll let you raise it up to a certain point, and then you just have to spin the base off from there. That's something that you have to get used to with this style of router because there is that rotation component. So if you're coming from a different brand, it takes a little getting used to, but certainly does the job. To remount the fixed base, just carefully align the two arrows and rotate it into place. From there, you can make coarse adjustments or fine adjustments with the micro adjust knob before locking it into place. The locking buckle on the 23 is super robust, but it also kind of feels like a bear trap too, so you almost have to watch your fingers. On either of these machines, I do prefer to remove the bases upside down, so start with the coarse adjustment button and lift straight up. That'll get you as far as the safety lock position. Push this secondary safety lock and lift it straight out. So what they've done with the design here is eliminate that rotation component for removing or installing bases, and I think I prefer that just a little bit better. To reinstall the base, just align the low voltage track on the front and you'll be able to drop it straight into position, coarse adjust, fine adjust before locking it home. In plunge mode, the 1617 feels smaller and more nimble compared to the bigger Bosch router. Those differences are almost negligible when you're in fixed mode, but when you switch over to the plunge base, suddenly it feels lighter to use the 1617. The MRC23 is a heavier unit in the plunge base, and it's actually got a wider base too. Whether that's a pro or a con for you just probably depends on what type of router you like and how you're going to use the machine, but full 7 inches wide on the base of the plunge for the MRC23, whereas the fixed base of this router is actually just the standard 6-inch width. Installing the motor in the plunge base is even easier. It just slides straight down and then you can lock your buckle. But as far as the plunge lock mechanism, there's no free plunge on these routers. It's a press to release variety. So you release the lever, plunge down to desired depth, and it'll stay there until you press the lever again to release it. Installing the motor into the plunge base of the 1617 is very similar. Just rotate it, drop it in place, and this buckle has a little bit of slack in it, so initial impression is, well, how well is this going to work? But actually it works quite well, and I think it's even a little bit easier to operate than the 23, but It just is built with a little bit of slack in the mechanism, and I don't see that as a negative. Let's talk for a second about the style of plunge and the action of the plunge on these routers. Now the 1617 has external plunge springs, and that requires it to have these dust shields, whereas the MRC has internal plunge springs, and so on the plunge rods you just see a nice metal exterior. There's no springs visible there. Now as far as the action of these two plunge mechanisms, the MRC23 I would say has a firmer plunge action that has been more reliable in my experience. The 1617 is a little bit lighter plunging action. It's easier to press down, but it sometimes has a tendency to stick in the down position. That was only a problem if I was partially supported off the edge of a workpiece. And the solution I've found to that is to remove the factory wet grease on the plunge rods and actually replace that with a dry lubricant. That seemed to help quite a bit. Another nice feature is this flip down chip shield, and without any tools you can drop that out of your way for making adjustments to the machine or pop it back up when you're ready to route. So the way that you make fine adjustments to the bit depth varies a little bit between these two routers. The 1617 has a real traditional depth stop rod and turret, so you can have several preset locations for your depth stop. And then there's also a fine adjustment knob on the end of that plunge rod. So if you've used many plunge routers, this system will seem very familiar to you. On the MRC23, it just takes a different approach. While you still have a depth stop rod and a turret with several positions, you also have this unique feature, which is an afterlock microfine adjuster. And that actually allows you to make fine adjustment to the bit depth even after the router is locked into place. Now as far as router accessories, sometimes that's a make or break point as to which model you choose, and luckily there's a really good variety of accessories available for these Bosch routers. There's an excellent edge guide and there's a guide bushing adapter kit. Both of those fit these units interchangeably. Even the basic wrenches that you'll use for bit changes work on both of these kits. One exception to that is the 3-piece dust collection units that are available separately. Although they are available for both models, you'll have to source that specific to the router that you're using. One attaches to the plunge base, one for the fixed base, and a third version is available for edge profiling. These fittings are sturdy enough and they certainly seem to do their job well. I only wish they were a little more integrated into the overall design of the router. Now to accept any kind of guide bushing on these routers, you'll need this adapter kit that has, for starters, a quick release that will allow you to use these proprietary Bosch guide bushings. The quick release adapter attaches to the top side of your sub base and it's held in place with 2 screws. And you'll also need this secondary adapter if you'd like to use a more standard 1 3/16 inch guide bushing. In my opinion, Bosch would appeal to a lot more US customers if they just included a second sub-base that would directly accept a 1 3/16 inch, or sometimes called a Porter cable style guide bushing. So what about mounting the fixed base in a router table? Which of these two kits wins in that regard? And actually I'd have to say neither really excels at mounting in a router table if you're using the included base. Now let me qualify that by saying the 1617 would be excellent in a router table if you have a dedicated router lift. But if you're trying to use the base that it comes with, even though it has that wrench for topside height adjustment, it really is not going to let the collet extend above the table hardly at all. So it'll make topside bit changes really awkward, even if you're using bent wrenches that Bosch does offer as an optional accessory. So really awkward bit changes in that regard. Now, if you're trying to do that same thing with the MRC23 and use the fixed base for mounting in a router table, that can work. Although it has that same sort of problem, the collet won't extend high enough for easy bit changes. If you're looking to mount a router in a dedicated lift, the MRC23 is not the one to choose, and that's just because the low voltage track will physically get in the way and prevent you from mounting the motor in a dedicated lift. I do like that you can use an edge guide simultaneously with the dust collection fittings, although I wish these screws had springs on their shaft so that they wouldn't vibrate loose when you're not using an edge guide. Dual LED lights are an added benefit on the MRC23. So, final thoughts on comparing these two popular routers from Bosch. I think the MRC23 might have a clear case for a win over the 1617, specifically in the fixed base. It just feels a little bit more modern and the ergonomics seem to be better. You'd have to give it the nod for safety as well because it's got that trigger in the handle. Now with the Plunge base, things are a little bit different. The MRC23 there is a little bigger and bulkier when it's in plunge mode, so some users may just prefer the lighter plunge action and the classic styling of the 1617. Do look for information on a Popular Woodworking router review, not just these routers, but a full fleet of 9 or 10 routers that I reviewed for the magazine. If you drop down to the description box, you'll find issue information there. Hey, give me a thumbs up if you like the topic and consider subscribing to the Thoughtful Woodworker channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. I mean, they're both Bosch, right? You're not going to go wrong.